I'd just like to welcome everyone this evening to our presentation surrounding suicide prevention. Again, just want to welcome you guys for taking your time out of this evening to spend with us. And just, in normal occasions, we'd tell you housekeeping where the restrooms are. But at this point, in the virtual world, what we do need to let you know that is we are recording this event. So just keep that in mind, and that we will be monitoring the Q&A function during the webinar. So if you have questions, please do ask them. We want to make sure you leave here with all the information that you need. We have our assistant principals, Dr. Coy and Ms. Garman, as well as some of our counselors, Ms. Espinoza, and I believe Ms. Hernandez is on the line too. So we have maybe some staff members here, but I just want to say thank you for being here. And, we've got a really important topic to talk about this evening. So, this is the North County community. I know we have some SDA families here, and a lot of our LCC families are here as well. So, together we are one big family, and just knowing that it's been a hard year for all of us. And I just wanted to say thank you again. By the way, I'm Reno Medina. I am the principal of La Costa Canyon High School, and just want to acknowledge that the topic we're going to talk about is suicide prevention. It reflects the work that we need to do in supporting our students and our families and our staff members here across the board. So many of us have known someone or have family members who have experienced a loved lost one through suicide. So just, at this point, we want people to leave here with tools to be able to create space for students and family members, and so that we can reach out with a loving hand and take care of each other. I just want to let you guys know that, this year, as our school and many years before in other schools in our district and even in North County, we have had a loss of students, both on this campus and on other campuses to suicide. So, this is a very important topic. You are going to hear from an amazing speaker this evening. His name is Stan Collins. We had the opportunity to meet with our staff this morning, and he was just, it was amazing. Our staff was well informed about suicide prevention, about signs to look for, and it left with just knowing that we feel comfortable having conversations with students and with one another. So I'm going to turn it over to Stan Collins at this point. And again, thank you for being here. It was just a pleasure to have you back with us, Stan. Truly appreciate your time, and families, welcome again.
Thanks, Reno. I appreciate it. And again, a big shout out to your staff. It was so great to get the time with them. You got an incredible team there. And I was honored that you trust me with that. And thank you for trusting me to be here with the parents. So good evening, everyone. My name is Stan Collins. I'm a suicide prevention specialist. And I want to give you a little bit more background on myself first, and then we're going to dive into it. But to give you some context, I've worked in suicide prevention for about 20 years. I'm going to tell you the story of how I got involved in the work here in just a minute. But I'm the co-founder of the Directing Change program. I also have done work with the Department of Education. There was a statewide mandate a few years ago to roll out suicide prevention across California schools. Been doing a lot of trainings around that. And I'm part of the California Department of Education Student Mental Health Policy Work Group. Now, that is just my bio or my resume. But I hope that it will give you some context that to as much of a degree as one can. I have experience in this work, and I, to some degree know what I'm talking about. But the most valuable information I ever get is from the youth, and I've done a lot of work with them. But I want to start before we get into any of the content. And thank you for any of you who participated in the survey and gave us some feedback on what you're hoping to walk away with tonight. I think we're going to try to hit as many of those marks as we can, either during the content of the presentation or during the Q&A. So to give you a little bit of structure, I'm going to speak for a while. We're going to turn it back over to the school to remind you of some of the resources available. And then we're just going to open it up for a dialogue, because that's how communities heal. That's how communities grow, is by being able to ask the tough questions and learn from each other. But I want to start by talking to you about why I got involved in this work in the first place. So I'm a native San Diegan. I grew up over in Poway. I grew up in a family of cops. My mom and dad both retired as cops. My brother's currently a cop, and I'm the black sheep of the family. I went in more of the emergency medicine side of things. But growing up, me and my brother would always go places. He's 4 years older than me, and he had a best friend who had a younger brother, and that younger brother's name is Jesse. So whenever my older brother and his older brother would go places, our moms would force us to tag along. So me and Jesse have what I call an arranged friendship. So if they went to the beach or they went to the movies, me and Jesse would go. And over time, I grew on Jesse. Jesse was a year older than me. He was kind of a, cool guy, tough guy. I looked up to him. I admired him. And if you think back to when you were in high school, if someone was even a year older than you, you thought they had the whole world figured out. And that was Jesse to me. And so over time, I grew on him, like I said, and he took me under his wing. And this was a huge blessing to me because going into my freshman year at Poway High School, I was really lucky because me and Jesse ended up in the same fourth period geometry class. So not only did I have one of my best friends who could look out for me and give me some guidance, but I knew there was at least 1 hour out of the day where I could feel safe. I could go, I could sit with my friend. We'd go to lunch, a couple more classes, and the day was over. But one night I was walking down the hallway of my house and my older brother was coming towards me, and I noticed that he had tears in his eyes. Now, again, me and my brother are pretty different people, but he kind of hides his emotions. I'm very emotional. I cry at Hallmark cards and Disney movies and such. And my brother kind of tucks them away, but nonetheless, I walked up to him and I noticed when I got close that he had tears in his eyes. And even as a 14-year-old boy, I knew that for me to see tears in my brother's eyes, something bad had happened. And so I went up to him and I asked him what was going on. And I'll never forget what he said and how he said it when he told me that Jesse had died by suicide. And I remember the weight of the world hitting me with those words. And I remember stumbling back until I hit the wall and sliding down and putting my head between my knees and crying for hours. And I know I'm not the only one here who's lost somebody to suicide. And it's every emotion, right? It's anger, it's frustration, it's sadness, it's guilt, it's shame. It's why couldn't I have done this or why didn't they do that? And I sat there with that grief until eventually I made my way to bed. And I woke up the next morning, and as I was walking out of the door to go to school, I looked over and I realized my mom was in the kitchen. And normally my mom was already gone to work by this point, but she was there and she stopped me and she said, "Honey, you don't have to go to school today. Like, one of your best friends just died. Sit down, have breakfast. I took the day off. Let's process what happened." But for whatever reason, I was determined that I needed to go to school. And it wasn't until I was walking up the ramp to my fourth period geometry class that I had with Jesse that I realized why I was so determined to be there. And I was determined to be there because as I reached for the door to open it, there was every ounce of my being wanted to see that when I opened that door that Jesse was there and that this was all just a bad dream and you can just go back to life as normal. And instead what happened, obviously, is I opened that door and I saw his empty desk. And every day for the rest of that year, I sat next to my best friend's empty desk and wondered what I could have done, what I could have said. What if me and him would have had more important conversations? What if I would have created space? What if I would have seen this? Or what if he would have talked to me about that? Now, this was back in the mid-90s, and this was the dark ages as far as mental health and suicide prevention in the schools is concerned. And so we didn't have crisis support. We didn't have response. We didn't have conversations or safe places to go. And so me and Jesse's other friends were honestly left to deal with this in silence. Now, a few years later, fast forward to my senior year in high school, I mentioned my dad's a cop and he had asked me to come down to see a presentation from the Yellow Ribbon Suicide Prevention Program. And as a teenager who was involved in peer counseling, who had lost a friend to suicide, come down and just thumbs up, thumbs down, should the police department endorse the program? And honestly, I was biased because as soon as I heard the name of the program, it was the first time as a 17-year-old boy who'd already lost a friend to suicide that I had heard the word prevention attached to the word suicide. So I was excited right there. But I left the presentation feeling really empowered, feeling really confident that, man, we got to talk about this. Of all the topics that the adults in my lives, my parents, the educators had talked to me about, no one had ever talked to me about the one way in which my friend died, which was suicide. And so I went back to my principal the next day And I handed him a packet of information. I said, we got to do this program. We need to be talking about mental health. We need to be talking about suicide and suicide prevention. And he said, we'll come back in a few days and we'll talk about it and we'll see about it, see what we can do. So I came back a few days later and I walked in his office and I said, hey, have you had a chance to look through the stuff? Can we do it? And he said, I'm a principal. I got really busy. Come back in a few more days and we'll talk about it. So I came back a few days later and I got the same response. And I came back a few days later and I got the same response. We did this dance for a few weeks and then a few months till one day I walk in his office and looking back, I don't know if this was the right time or the wrong time, but he said, you know what, Stan, you're not going to let this go. You're a good kid. If you think this is something that the other students need to hear, then raise the money and we'll make it happen. So I partnered with the local Yellow Ribbon chapter. We raised the money and we had coordinated for the founders of the program, Dale and Dar Emmy, who had lost their son to suicide a few years before, to fly out and to give a presentation to the school. Now, back at that time, the thinking was we would gather all the kids in the gym. Nowadays, we know that to have these conversations, we need to get youth into smaller settings, have more intimate conversations where they can dialogue and ask questions. But at the time, we gathered all the youth, every single student in the school, into the gym, all 3,000 of them. And right before Dale and Dar were about to speak, they looked at me and they said, hey, Stan, have you thought about what you're going to say? And as a senior in high school, one of the things you're most concerned about, or at least that I was my image, right? Like, wait, no, I can't. I did this. This is your job now. I can't get in front of my class and talk about suicide and suicide prevention. And they were really encouraging. They said, we think you have a very powerful message to share. And I remembered that I had written a poem in memory of my friend Jesse. And so I dug in my backpack and I dug it out and I had this crinkled piece of paper. And so now here I am, senior in high school, standing in front of my entire school, and I'm reading a poem. And as you can imagine, I was just mortified. And I was just beating myself up on the inside thinking, man, how could you ever think this was a good idea? How could you ever think that this would make a difference? How could you ever believe that one person can make an impact? So I stumbled through the poem. I stumbled through whatever I said. And I went home that night. I skipped practice, crawled into bed, and just wanted the whole day to be erased from the record books. I was so worried about how people in my school would respond or react the next day. And as I was walking onto campus at Poway High, the campus used to be set up so there was an attendance window that looked out kind of towards the front of the school. And as I was walking onto campus, I saw the attendance lady behind the window and we made eye contact. And as soon as she saw me, she turned around and she walked out of the back of the building, and I saw her walking towards me. And so now, again, I was a pretty good kid, but I was freaking out. The attendance lady is heat seeking me from across the campus. Like, what have I done? What did I do wrong? And as she comes up to me, she has this warm look on her face and she has an envelope in her hand. And she comes up to me, and I'll never forget the words that she said, but she told me that, Stan, I have a gift for you. And she hands me the envelope. I open it up and it's a letter from a girl named Sarah. Now, I don't know who Sarah is to this day. She didn't give me her last name or her last initial. But in her letter, Sarah went on to tell me that she had been thinking about suicide. And that yesterday when she showed up and she saw this presentation, it was the first time in her life that she heard someone else say the S word, that she heard someone else talk about suicide. And she said that the presentation inspired her in so many ways to reach out for help. One is that she had had so much pain in her heart that she had convinced herself that people would be better off without her. And when I talked about how much pain I felt when I lost Jesse, she realized that she needed to take a step back and look at how that might impact other people. She also thanked me for sharing the hope that I had, that we care for other people and naturally we'll be there if I just would have known that he was struggling. And she went on to tell me that poem that I was so embarrassed to read in front of my school, that she had actually gone and made copies of it and given it out to a bunch of people. And she had actually taken one of the copies and pinned it up next to her bed. And she was going to read it every single morning to remind her of her reasons for living. And to simplify, it basically went on in that letter to say that presentation, that conversation had saved her life. And I share this story with you because as a 17-year-old boy who had no experience in mental health, no training in suicide prevention, but simply because I was willing to talk about it, I was able to help someone find their reasons for living. And so I share this with you in the hopes that you never underestimate the role that you can have in helping someone find their reasons for living. And I use that phrasing very purposefully because when I first got involved in suicide prevention, I thought that my job was to convince other people not to die. And I thought another part of my job was to train people how to convince people not to die. But what I came to understand is that suicide is not about wanting to die. Suicide is about not knowing how to go on living with that pain that you feel in your soul. And so therefore, suicide prevention isn't about convincing someone not to die. It's about helping someone find their reasons for living. Because in my opinion, when you simplify suicide down to its two most basic factors, it's about pain and hope. And suicide happens when that pain outweighs that hope. And in that moment, or as we're supporting somebody, it's not about erasing all the pain from their life. That's unrealistic. And it's not about injecting them with overwhelming hope for the future. But in that moment and every moment after that, it's about turning the dials just a little bit. And there's going to be days when we have regression and we fall back a little bit, but that's what suicide prevention is that about holding on or helping someone find their hope until they're sturdy enough to find it themselves. So as we jump in tonight, again, my presentation or my training, the conversation we're about to have isn't just about educating you. That's what a lot of you asked for in that survey, but it's also about making you more comfortable with the topic, making you or helping you to embrace your own abilities to support people, your children, your friends, your family. A lot of the things we're going to talk about tonight are geared towards your youth, but those same skills, those same warning signs, those same questions to ask, those same resources apply regardless of who you're supporting. So with that, as we're going tonight, please utilize the chat, the question and answer portion. There's going to be times where I'm asking for your feedback and for you to interact with me as well. But as we wrap up later, we're going to come back and we're going to answer a lot of those questions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation. Anybody on the support team, if you can just send me a note or let me know if the slides don't come through. Otherwise, I'm going to assume they're there, or maybe even a verbal cue from somebody. Everything good to go? You guys can see them?
We're good to go, Stan.
All right, great. Thank you. All right, so let's jump in. So I just want to take a moment and let you know that I mentioned earlier, I'm the co-founder of Directing Change. So I'm able to be here through support from that program. I'm going to give you the website later, but we're funded by statewide efforts to support mental health for youth. So with that, before we jump into the topic of mental health and suicide prevention, I think it's important to talk about your own mental health. That you may have had big goals for what you were going to accomplish over the past year, or I mean, none of us thought it would be a year. And some of you may be beating yourselves up about you wish you could have done that or done this. And some of you may wish you had, parented better during this time. But I want to acknowledge that you're not a bad parent. You're a parent during extraordinary times. And the amount of stress, the weight from whatever other circumstances, from switching in job and dealing with social isolation, all those things, you've survived to whatever degree that means. And maybe some of you out there did lose somebody during the pandemic. Maybe you've lost somebody recently. I dealt with COVID myself. I had it. So whatever survived means to you and whatever capacity, you're here today. But I think you would all agree that you recognize that parenting was never intended to be 24/7. And we understand and have so much more value for the services and the supports that schools offer for us. But as we go into this, one of the things you're going to hear me say a lot tonight is just breathe. We're here, and it's not about, there's a quote that I have that it's, I can only hold myself accountable for what I know today, not what I will learn tomorrow. And all we can hope to do is continue to improve, to continue to get better and support each other as we're going. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to engage with me in the chat at this. If you could go ahead and tell me what are some of the causes for suicide? So again, just type it in the chat. What are some of the causes of suicide? This is the interactive part of the presentation. So I'm hoping you'll engage with me in the chat. Your chat is located on that bar at the bottom. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Zoom. But what are some of the causes of suicide? And I don't see any chats right now, but I know you're out there. I see you in the participant list. So I know you're here. What are some of the causes of suicide?
Dan, I think we have the chat box.
Oh, it says chat disabled. All right, that's my fault. I'm calling you guys out. All right, so
write it in the Q&A.
All right, so Q&A. Well, I don't want to flood the Q&A because I don't want to lose track. So that's my fault, everybody. I apologize. Zoom technology strikes again. So anyways, many of you were probably trying to say, it's mental illness, it's bullying, it's breakups, it's social isolation, it's distance learning, it's a number of things. It's hopelessness, it's heartbreak, and the point that I want to make with that is that it's easy. It helps us to understand and make sense of suicide when we say that it was caused by one thing. The reality, though, is that it's never, if ever, one thing that causes suicide. And to use a metaphor, the board game Jenga, you see the image on the screen. So those of you not familiar with Jenga, you take a bunch of blocks, you stack them into a tight tower, and then you take turns pulling out these blocks and restacking them until somebody eventually will pull out a block that causes the whole tower to fall. And we say, well, that person lost, right? Because that one block caused the whole tower to fall. Now, in reality, we know it wasn't that one block. It was all the other pieces of that structure that have been pulled out that weaken the sturdiness of it. And if we use this as an analogy for suicide, again, we want to point to that last block that falls. There's a lot of conversation right now about what that last block might be, but it's not that one piece. It's all the other pieces that have been pulled out. It's that individual's inability to strengthen their own structure. And we can't, again, prevent bad things from happening in people's lives, but what we can do is help reinforce that structure. So this idea of what causes suicide is a bit of a trick question, because the term cause means if A, then B. If I drop this pencil, it will fall because me dropping it caused it to fall. And the reason why I bring this up, it has to do with messaging. And we have to be very careful about the messages that we put out around suicide. And to start that part of the conversation, I want to talk to you about just for a minute about language. So some of the recommended terminology from the suicide prevention community is one of the terms we're trying to get away from, trying to avoid, is committed suicide, which unfortunately is the most common term that we use when we describe somebody dying by suicide. We say that they have committed suicide. And so I would ask you, since the chat doesn't work, what are some of the other actions that we commit? Fill in the blank. We commit blank. We commit blank. And you would probably say, well, we commit crime, we commit sin, we commit treason and perjury and adultery, a lot of negative things. But we also commit to our family. We commit to our friends. We commit to our jobs. We commit to our responsibilities. But that term committed brings with it a very negative connotation, typically associated with crime or sin. So we want to avoid that term and instead head over and use the term died of suicide, died by suicide, or took their own life. A lot of people are shocked to find out it used to be illegal to attempt suicide. And a lot of faith institutions are starting to change the way they frame suicide, because they would frame suicide as the sin or the equivalent because they wanted to prevent it. But what they realize is that framing suicide as a sin doesn't stop it from happening. It stops people from talking about it. Another term we're trying to avoid is use of the words unsuccessful versus successful, because successful suicide, if you break it down, means the person is dead, and unsuccessful suicide means the person is still alive. So there's no success or lack thereof when we're talking about suicide. So we would ask that you either use the term attempted suicide or died by suicide. It's very clear what those two actions were, what the result was. But again, it steers clear of that bias, that stigma, and the shame that we know helps shape our ideas. And to bring this home a little bit, there's something that we refer to as suicide prevention messaging, or safe and effective messaging. And there's something known as the Virtue effect. And the Virtue effect basically says that when we have negative messages, we will have negative outcomes. A few years back, when we were saying that bullying causes suicide, we saw an increase in suicides by kids who were being bullied because we removed a protective factor and we normalized suicide as a response to bullying. And I don't want to get political here, but when we say that that social isolation, that schools being closed, or COVID is causing suicide, we're actually sending a very dangerous message to our youth, because we're removing a protective factor and we're normalizing suicide as a response. So we need to be very careful with the messages that we put out. Now, on the other side of that is known as the Papageno effect. And the Papageno effect simply says that when we have positive messages, we will have positive outcomes, that people will reach out for help more. They will ask for support. People will recognize, they will understand that suicide can be prevented. The mental health can get better. So with that, if you want to learn more, you can go to suicidepreventionmessaging.org from the Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention that drafted the national strategy. But just a few of the recommendations when we're talking about suicide, we always want to provide a resource. We want to focus on actions that people can take, because most people don't know the warning signs. Most people don't know that it's okay to talk about suicide. Every suicide prevention program strategy in the country will say that the number one thing we can do to prevent suicide is to talk openly and directly about it. We need to avoid these normalizing statements of skyrocketing or epidemic, and understand that, yes, suicide is an issue, but we have to be careful of the messages that we put out. And again, we want to avoid oversimplifying those causes. Now, I also want to take a step back and look at some of the data. Every single individual, youth or adult, older adult who dies by suicide is a tragedy. The bigger travesty, however, is how many youth are in such emotional pain that they think about suicide on a day-to-day basis. Now, the saddest part of my work is that these numbers have not changed over the past 20 years. We see about 20% of youth will report that they have thought about suicide in the previous 12 months. We will see that about 1 in 10 youth will say that they've made a suicide attempt in the previous 12 months. And before you ask, we don't have the current data for what's happened over the past year. It's all anecdotal at this point. But what we know is even on an average year, 1 in 5 youth will say they've considered it, and 1 in 10 youth will say that they've attempted it. And we should just be mobilizing right now when we realize how many youth are in that much pain. So I wanted to paint a picture. When we talk about death by suicide, that's only the tip of the iceberg, and we need to do better. I've been working with the school over the last few days, last few weeks to make plans, not just to engage here with you tonight, but as mentioned, to meet with the staff. And we have plans in place to work with the students to help make mental health and suicide prevention just a life skill, something we talk about on a regular basis. Now, the good news is we know what works to prevent suicide. The problem is we haven't implemented all things in any, one area at this point. So what we're doing, like what I just said, we're hoping to do is work with you, work with students, work with staff to put all these things in place. But to prevent suicide, I've tried to simplify it into 5 buckets. Number 1, we simply need to know what to look for. We need to know what signs of distress are. And the reality is that intuitively, most of us know what to be paying attention to. We know what somebody looks like when they're feeling distress. The hardest part, though, is connecting A to B. We know what mental health distress looks like, but it's hard for us, and it's even harder as a parent, I would imagine, to connect A to B. Your brain doesn't want to allow you to think that the people that you care about, especially your children, could be capable of suicide. And so you're fighting your own intuition, your own instincts. But if you see the warning signs, the only way that we will ever know whether or not those warning signs mean the person is in distress or in crisis and potentially a risk of suicide is the next one down, which is asking directly about suicide. And we're going to talk about that later tonight. I'm going to give you the questions and hopefully impart with you the skills to be able to talk openly and directly about suicide and ask the question, are you thinking about suicide? From there, we need to connect them to that next level of support to get assessed, to get screened. We also want to make sure we do a safety plan with them. I'm going to share with you a little more details on what a safety plan is, but it's basically helping someone to swim against the rip current instead of hoping somebody's there to throw them a life preserver, giving them the skills, the coping strategies, how to recognize their own signs of distress. We also want to help put them in a safe environment and remove access to lethal means. From there, they're going to need some therapeutic help, but we can't just send them to any therapist. We have this assumption, similar to the way that you would assume that any doctor knows CPR and is really good at CPR. That's not the case. Same way that if you broke your foot, you wouldn't go see an ear, nose, and throat doctor. You would want to go see somebody who specializes in feet, right? You'd want to go see a podiatrist. When you are connecting somebody to mental health around suicide, you also want to make sure that they've been properly trained. There's 4 treatment modalities, none of which are specific to medication, just therapeutic models that have been shown to be effective in reducing suicidality. So when you're connecting your child or someone you care about to a mental health professional, ask, hey, what type of training have you received? What type of training have you participated in about ongoing care for suicide risk? And one of the things we're really trying to do as a system, this includes schools and law enforcement, hospitals, and emergency care, is try to respond to youth in the least restrictive way. Because what we have found out is that when we press the red button and overreact, we're actually inadvertently increasing risk by traumatizing youth. And there are absolutely times where we have to be really acute and aggressive with our response. But coming and speaking of this as an EMT, there are many times where we are over responding. And one of the most important questions we can ask a child when they're having thoughts about suicide is, what would you like? What's going to keep you safe? What do you need? Now, we've kind of jumped in, but I want to take another moment back. And really, suicide prevention among youth starts by building resiliency. Again, as we talked about with the Jenga analogy, it's not preventing bad things from happening. It's making them more resilient when those bad things happen. And it starts by helping them foster positive connections. And that's been really tough to nurture over the past year. But we can still get creative. And as things are getting back to this new normal, helping to really make sure that they build those new connections. As a parent, it's not fair to ask yourself to be fully aware of everything going on with your child. And when you think back to, when you were a kid, I know when I was a kid, there were absolutely things that I wouldn't talk to my parent about, but I would talk to a coach about, or a teacher, an aunt or an uncle, or someone, someone who is mentoring me. So foster those connections, help build those emotional skills, not just in the school setting, but at home. And I'm going to show you in just a second some of the ways you can do that. And as silly as it sounds, one of the most important things we can do for our mental health, or our youth mental health, is the 3 most basic things to keep us healthy. And those are to eat right, to exercise, and get a good amount of sleep. And when you think about it, what are the first 3 things we stop doing when we're stressed out? We stop eating right, we stop exercising, we stop getting a good amount of sleep. And so sometimes it starts by doing the basics. Just by getting to the basics, it will help normalize that teenage angst and those changes that are going on. For me, I'm really good at sleeping. So when I'm stressed out, when I'm, out of equilibrium, out of balance, I focus on sleeping. And I know if I'll sleep good for a few days, then I'll start to exercise. Once I start to exercise, I'll start to eat better. So sometimes it's about getting back to the basics. But as far as creating safe space for your youth, I have a really good friend of mine who lost his son to suicide a few years ago. And he talks very powerfully about this moment he had after his son had died, where one of the things we don't talk about as loss survivors very much is our anger. Like, why did this happen? But he said there was this moment where he was really angry about what happened. And he just couldn't understand why his son didn't talk to him about his thoughts of suicide, why his son didn't open up to him about these feelings of depression. And he said he finally realized, well, of course that's what my son's going to, of course that's what my son's going to show me, because that's all I ever showed him. Even on the days when I was angry or sad or frustrated, I always tried to stay right in the middle. I always tried to stay very stoic. And so what I didn't realize I was doing is I was modeling to my kid, keep your emotions in check. You need to be in the middle. You need to be stoic. So of course he didn't tell me. So one of the best things that you can do is start to show some of your emotions. Allow your kids to see that you have days where you're frustrated. You have days where you're angry, even if there's no reason for it. There's days where you're sad. And start to model that it's okay to have these emotions, to talk about these emotions, and to seek out comfort when we're going through tough days. Also, just being aware of your resources. You're going to leave tonight with some of the best resources out there. And one of the other things I really want to encourage you to do is that if you are supporting your child through a tough time, whether it's mental health struggles, whether it's just being a parent during whatever's going on in the world right now, or if it's, thoughts of suicide, have your supports in place. Make sure that you have that buddy that you can go to decompress, to debrief with, who can support you. Another thing we need to do for ourselves and really stress to our youth is that healing takes time. Whether it's suicide, whether it's a mental illness, or whether it's just struggling with mental health, we are all work in progress. It's not about finding a cure. It's about caring for whatever that is that ails us. And we're going to fluctuate throughout our time. So just really encourage our youth to not expect them just within a couple of weeks to be better. You're not just going to get back out there and everything's going to be fine. This is going to be a progression. And where you end up at the end of this is different than where you started this journey. Another thing I tell youth who face struggles or adversity in younger ages is that you don't see this now, but these struggles that you're facing are going to prepare you and empower you so much more than your peers in the future. When you get to your 20s, you will be so much more resilient for what you are going through right now. So you have to be patient. You have to hold on to hope. And one of the toughest things as adults when we're looking after youth is just what's normal and what's abnormal. And that whole idea of normal versus abnormal is, turned on its head right now during the pandemic. We know that mood changes are part of the youth experience, hormonal changes, growing changes, just who they are, who they start high school with is not going to be who they end high school as. That being said, we have to remain vigilant. And really what we're looking for is changes that continue or persist. Typically, we say about 2 to 3 weeks is really when we want to be concerned, but any sort of mood fluctuations, behavior changes is when we want to be aware. So some of the questions to ask yourself is, has your child lost interest? And at the beginning of the pandemic, of course they did, because they were told to. They were told to stop doing this. but then hopefully they found some new hobbies, some new things to get into, but have they lost interest in these newer hobbies? Are their mood swings dramatic? Are their behaviors dramatic? One of the warning signs we'll talk about in just a moment is anger and agitation, and how that relates to mental health or suicide. But have you seen a lot of that, or those risky behaviors? And that final question is really more about building towards thoughts of suicide. That's when we really want to be concerned. And that's really what separates low risk from high risk, is when we start to see youth take actions or behaviors towards a suicide attempt, and giving away belongings is one of those. But I want to start now by going into some of the warning signs. A lot of you asked for, what are some of the warning signs? What do I pay attention to? And these are what I call the big three. That when we hear someone or see someone talking or writing about death or suicide, not just once in a while. I mean, we all have to allow ourselves space to contemplate life and death. But when it's a persistent theme, and even if it's just a one-time thing, just asking, hey, what's going on there? Another one, as I said, is when we start to see behaviors. So when a child starts to, or a youth starts to look online about how to, or when they start to look for means or methods to make a suicide attempt, again, they have moved from thoughts of suicide towards intent and towards a plan. And that's when we really want to be concerned. But the number one thing we're looking for is hopelessness. Now, I can't describe hopelessness to you right now. It's all different. It's all different. And it's something we feel. It's something we sense. There's other warning signs, though. There is, of course, withdrawal and isolation. There's sadness. There is, hopelessness, as we talked about. Youth might also start to neglect their personal appearance. I've heard someone describe brushing their teeth in the midst of severe depression as paramount to climbing Mount Everest. Sometimes the small things become overwhelming. And I want to circle back to that reckless behavior or anger. As a young boy, I was taught one of the emotions I'm allowed to have was anger. I was not told that it's okay to be sad or to cry. So anytime I felt pain, I turned to anger. And I think that for youth, many of them don't know how to deal with the sadness, and so they turn to anger. Now, the problem is that when someone is crying, our instincts are to pull them close. But when someone is angry, our instincts are a lot of the times, or when they're acting reckless, is to push them away. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is that either of those are rooted in some sort of pain. And the most important question you can ask about any of these warning signs we've talked about is why. What is the why in this change in behavior? What is the why and why they're neglecting their appearance? What is the why in their anger, their sadness, their withdrawal, their substance use, this giving away possessions? What is the why? Now, I want to talk to you about a couple other warning signs that are not on any official list, but through my experience and through what I've read and some of the research, one of the warning signs we also want to be aware of is a fear of failure or a perfectionism. A lot of the youth that I work with, a lot of the youth who I've been part of supporting, the families after the loss, were really high achievers. And I think we assume that when someone is having thoughts of suicide, they're not able to function on a day-to-day basis. And that's just not the truth. As we've seen with the celebrity suicides or the professional athlete suicides, Kate Spade, from Anthony Bourdain to Junior Seau, these are people who were functioning at really high levels at a task and yet had this tremendous emotional pain. And a lot of youth who have never known failure are so scared of it. And they're so scared and disappointing people are asking for help that they just simply don't know how to do it. About a decade ago, actually not, kind of in your area, there was a young lady who died by suicide, and the detectives came to me afterwards and they said, "Hey, Stan, I just don't get this one." This young girl, she was in middle school. She was ASB president, straight A student. She was first chair in the orchestra. Everybody loved her. Everybody liked her. This little girl was everything to everybody. And I said, "Detective, you just answered your own question. A 13-year-old girl or a middle school student or a high school student shouldn't have to feel like they have the pressure to be everything to everybody." So we need to work with our youth about those expectations, not just that they have of themselves, but what they perceive our expectations are of them. Another warning sign that was brought up in the questions in the survey was, is self-harm or self-mutilation a warning sign for suicide? And the answer is not necessarily. When I first got involved in this work, we said, absolutely, if a kid is self-harming, they're absolutely having thoughts of suicide, we need to get them assessed. What we've come to understand now is that self-harm is almost more like substance abuse. It's almost more like a self-medication, that they don't have a healthy coping mechanism, and so they turn to self-harm. Now, that doesn't mean that someone who's self-harming is not also thinking about suicide, so we want to screen them and assess them. And we want to ask them, are you thinking about suicide? But it's not necessarily an indicator. Now, one of the dangers, though, if someone who is already self-harming begins to have thoughts of suicide, they oftentimes will move or might progress more quickly through the stages towards a suicide attempt because they've begun to erode that fear of self-harm, of hurting themselves. And so that fear is actually a protective factor. So just hoping to answer some of the questions you all had there. So what do you do? Number one is, if anything I'm talking about today or anything moving forward, if there is any part of you that thinks that you should talk to a child or someone you love or care about suicide, then you need to talk to that person about suicide and ask them the question, are you thinking about suicide? If you can't do it, you need to find somebody who can. I want to tell you another story. A few years back, one of my cousins, younger cousin, he's a kid who I used to babysit every day after school. And when he was in high school, my family came to me because he was showing signs of depression. He was starting to say, some things that indicated he might be having thoughts of suicide. And they said, "Hey, Stan, you work in suicide prevention. You're obviously the person that should go talk to him." And I said, "Well, yeah, of course I'm the right person. We're so close, it'll be good." And as I went to talk to him, I found myself getting so choked up over the words. I couldn't even get the words out of my mouth or the question. This is a question that I literally asked tens of thousands of times. And yet, because I was so close and because I was so just devastated by the idea that this young boy who I helped raise could be having these thoughts, I realized afterwards that even with the training that I have, I was probably the worst possible person to have that conversation with him. And so sometimes we have to acknowledge our own weaknesses and say, I know this needs to happen, but I just can't do it. When you're building up to that, some of the things we'll say is, "Hey, I noticed you've been doing this lately. I noticed you've been pulling back or getting angry. I know you're going through a hard time with this or that." And sometimes when people are acting that way and going through what you're going through, they think about suicide. I just want to know, I care about you. Are you having thoughts of suicide? Now, one of the big fears about asking this question is that we assume there's a myth out there that if we talk about suicide, it's going to cause it to happen. Now, even when I was talking about messaging earlier, that doesn't mean that any of that messaging is going to put the idea in somebody's head. That negative messaging could just inadvertently nudge a vulnerable individual who's already having those thoughts closer to it. But when we ask somebody, are you thinking about suicide? It's not going to, input the idea in their head. There's a ton of research to show that that's the case. And the reality is that most youth that I talk to by 4th or 5th, 6th grade understand the idea of suicide. They don't necessarily understand the full ramifications. But what we know is that talking about suicide, asking someone, are you thinking about suicide, is not going to increase risk. In fact, what I would say is asking the question just in and of itself decreases risk, because in the tens of thousands of conversations I've had with youth who are having thoughts of suicide or who we were worried about, and asking the question, I've never once had one of them get mad at me or upset with me because I care about them or because I want to help them. And typically what I see when I ask that question is their shoulders relax, and it's like a pressure valve gets released. And now suicide is no longer this thing in their head. It's something that both of us are talking about. And I have a saying that goes, when we speak the name of the beast, it will retreat. Only by talking openly and directly about suicide can we ever hope to prevent it. That is literally the only way we can ever determine whether or not somebody is at risk for suicide, is just simply by asking them. And every suicide prevention program, as I mentioned, will tell you that talking openly is one of the key steps. Now, as you're building up to the conversation, again, I acknowledge it's not an easy one. So you got to center yourself. You got to take a breath. You want to make sure you're in a safe environment. One of the things I tell parents is that what I hear from kids a lot is that they don't want you to sit on the couch with them and look them, square in the eye and say, are you thinking about suicide? A lot of the times these mental health conversations or suicide prevention conversations happen during a hike or while you're building a fence or while you're doing a project. Sometimes when we make our hands busy, it's easier for our minds to be a little more free and our emotions to open up. You want to give yourself plenty of time. Same way that my mom said when she came home from work, let me get 2 feet in the door before you ask me any questions. Also be respectful of your youth's time, maybe as they're studying or cramming for the test or trying to wrap up the final or preparing for, a sporting event or whatever, isn't the best time. So continue to create that space. And one of the questions I get the most is, when is the best time to talk to my kid about mental health and suicide? And what I would say to that is, before you have any concerns about mental health and suicide prevention, even if you're not seeing any warning signs, start to set the table, create the space, and use tonight's presentation as an excuse and say, I saw this presentation and it made me realize I had no idea. I'm just curious, have any of your friends ever talked to you about suicide? Have any of your friends ever attempted? Have you ever had thoughts of suicide? Another concern when people are talking to, especially a child or youth about suicide is they're so worried about saying the wrong thing. And the reality is that it's very difficult to say the wrong thing. If you're coming from a place of compassion and empathy, it's very difficult to say the wrong thing. And ultimately, you should be listening more than you talk. There's a proverb that says we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so that we can listen twice as much as we speak. And in these moments when we're talking to youth who are struggling, it's so in our instincts to want to jump in and fix the problem, or to tell them, time heals all wounds, or there's plenty of fish in the sea, and use the same cliches that our parents passed along to us. But what they really need to hear is validation. What they really need to hear is, I can't imagine how hard this must be for you. And again, anytime that we're supporting somebody, we need to make sure we have our own supports in place and to follow up. All right, so you're there. You've now asked your child, are you thinking about suicide? But what if they say no? First, I want to say that this is actually the best case scenario, right? We don't want our child to be thinking about suicide. And yet people are scared about, well, what if I ask them and this is the response? What I would say is that it's actually wonderful, because what you've communicated to your child is that I'm not scared to talk about scary things. I care about you that much that I'm willing to have that awkward conversation. So if you ever do have thoughts of suicide, or if any of your friends ever have thoughts of suicide, I want you to know that I'm one of the people that is safe to come to. You want to continue. Obviously, there was still a reason why you were worried about them. So to continue to support that coping and that resiliency, remind them, without any judgment, that whatever they need to talk to you about, that you're there for them. And if not, you'll help connect them to the people who are. All right. So what if they say yes? One of the things I hear from youth the most is that parents don't take them seriously. They dismiss it. They say it's not that bad. You're just seeking attention. This is just a cry for help. And one thing I need to encourage you is that if anybody has to resort to threatening suicide to get attention, then one of the most important things we can do for them in that moment is to give them attention, and then to figure out whether or not they were serious. And if they weren't serious, use that as a teachable moment to let them know, hey, when you say that, that scares me. Here's some other ways you can let me know when you need attention. But most of the time, youth are pretty serious. There's at least part of them that is. Unfortunately, though, what happens is when a child talks about suicide, they'll connect to the school starts the assessment, and the parents will come in, and the kids now realizing how real this got. And so they'll start to backpedal, and they'll say that, oh, I was just joking. You guys are overreacting. Another thing is to remain calm. It's okay to show emotions. It's okay to cry, but just to be present, just to try to stay calm with them. Another thing you can say is, wow, thank you. I wish I would have been as courageous as you are at your age to be able to talk to my parents about this. So thank you for telling me. And again, the most important action that you can listen is to really listen. Now, from there, you're going to have to connect your child to more help, right? You can reach out to your school. Your school's going to come back on in a minute, talk to you how to access them, get some of those supports. But at some point, your child needs to get connected to a mental health professional to get screened or assessed. And earlier, again, we want to make sure we're connecting them to people who are properly trained. Now, in that moment, let's say it's 10 o'clock at night, you're talking to your kid. They've told you they're having thoughts of suicide. Obviously, you can't contact your school counselor at that moment. So one of the resources that a lot of people are not aware of is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. You can call them after talking to your kiddo and say, hey, this is what's going on. Here's the situation. You could even call them with your kid, say, what do we do now? How do we keep my child safe, or my friend, my family member safe? And they can give you guidance on where to go, what to do. They can help you assess that level of risk. And they might tell you, just keep the environment safe. And then first thing in the morning, take them somewhere, take them to a therapist, whatever it is. You can also contact the Lifeline if you're preparing. If you need a little bit of pep talk and coaching to talk to your kid about this, you can call them ahead of time and say, hey, I'm worried about my kid. What do I say? What do I do? I need a refresher. So don't be afraid. Another thing you as a parent can do in the moment is make a safety plan. So this is a mobile app. It's based on a research and evidence-based strategy called Safety Planning Intervention. It's called My3. So it's available for free on iPhone or Android. And basically what it does is it helps the youth identify their own stressors, their own coping strategies, some places and people that can distract them, a crisis network, and then crisis support services. You see there's a green button there where with one click of the button, they can connect to the National Lifeline, or if it's an emergency and a true crisis, they can contact 911. So I just want to make you aware of that. That's another thing that your school is going to do if they ever assess your child or screen your child. And it's something that you want to make sure the mental health professional does. When they're done, say, hey, did you do a safety plan? And if they didn't, go find a new mental health professional, because a safety plan is a very standard precaution and skill that we want to provide with youth who are thinking about it. So again, you are not alone. A lot of people perceive that National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is something that you can only call in an emergency. A lot of people think it's like 911, that there is a threshold of emergency that you need to pass before you can contact them. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you can contact the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. You'll be connected to a trained counselor. Here in San Diego, we have one of the best crisis centers in the country. Everybody who works on our call center has at least 2 years of clinical experience, works every day on the call line, and they can help you regardless of the circumstances. Another resource, though, is the crisis text line. 2 different organizations, but offer the same type of service, except obviously the crisis text line is done via text. National Lifeline is done over the phone, or you can go to suicidepreventionlifeline.org to get connected over a chat service. Another phenomenal resource that not enough people know about is Teen Line. Teen Line is actually a warm line or a support line that is staffed by other teenagers. They go through over 100 hours of training. They're supervised by a mental health professional. They take calls from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. every single night. They do the text chat from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. But it's a way for youth to be able to connect to a youth. And a lot of times it's not suicide. It's breakup issues or academic pressures or issues with family. Now, outside of the hours of 6 to 10, if you call that number, a youth calls that number, the calls get automatically routed to the D.D. Hirsch Crisis Center, which is the crisis call center for Los Angeles. So it's never a bad number to call, but those youth supports are there from 6 to 10. I mentioned earlier that I'm with the Directing Change program. I just want to let you know that in addition to the film contest, and if we have time, I'll pull up a film before we close out for the night. Youth create 30 or 60-second films, and through the film creation process, they learn all the things we want them to learn. DirectingChangeCA.org is the website, and I hope you'll spend some time checking it out. Now, if you want to revisit some of the information, if somebody's looking for information on suicide prevention, I would encourage you to go to these websites. You'll recognize the one on the top left from earlier. That is the English version. So the website is suicidespreventable.org. The Spanish language version is el suicidio es prevenible.org. You can learn about warning signs. You can also revisit some of those conversation tools and what kind of questions to ask. So with that, this is my email. You're welcome to contact me, but I do want to stress before we open it up or turn it over to your school, I am not a crisis counselor. This is an email address. If you send me an email, I may not see it right away. If you are in crisis, if it's an emergency, if someone is in severe distress, please contact one of those resources I shared with you. But if you want to ask questions about the program, you want to learn more, have a training, for another organization, please feel free to reach out to me. So other than that, I'm going to go ahead and pause, and I'm going to welcome Jamie to take it over and talk a little bit about some of the school resources. And then I will be back in just a few minutes to answer any of the questions that you have out there. So Jamie, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Stan. Stan, just want to say thank you for being here, and thank you for being such a wonderful support to our school and resource. What I kind of wanted to go over quickly is just some LCC specific and district resources that we have here. And then we will definitely get back to Stan and get to some of your questions as well. So just taking a look at our support team here at LCC, we have a whole team to work in partnership with you and with your student. So just taking a look, we have, let me make sure, we have counselors as well as school psychologists, student support specialists, of course, our admin team, and we have a lot of support staff that can help you through kind of what your challenges are and your students' challenges are. So please feel free to reach out to us. We want to work in partnership with you and the outside supports that you may need for your student as well. We have a lot of resources available on our website, both on the district website as well as our LCC website. So there's a lot of resources in just kind of social emotional wellness, self-care, through our virtual calm room. We've definitely had to be creative with resources available in this virtual world. We also have lots and lots of resources available that you can access. Care Solace would be one of our #1 resources available to you. This is available to our entire district as a key place to point you in the right direction of your specific needs. So whether or not, insurance or no insurance and what your student specific needs are, they can point you in the right direction. So this is kind of the information line when it comes to mental health related programs and counseling services. So that's definitely a good place to start as well. Also, once again, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is definitely a resource to keep on hand. Snap a picture of that, have your students snap a picture of it, have it programmed into your student's phone, into your phone, so that it's a quick and easy resource that you can always have on hand if needed. Lots of great resources available that we have posted on our LCC website, our district website, as well as we'll put the recording of this presentation and the great resources that Stan has also recommended. We'll make sure are also in our e-news as another place to get a quick reference. We have an amazing team here. We have Miss Miss Espinoza here as well. I'd like to just have her introduce herself. She is our department chair, our head counselor here at LCC. So just one of the great resources that we have here.
Hi, good evening. Just wanted to share as well what an amazing have available in our counseling department. And so really do want to encourage, parents and, your students themselves, if there's concerns, if there's worries, if there's ways that we can support you, please feel free to reach out to us. Email 24/7, it's always there, but we do have during school hours, if you can't get through directly to one of the specific counselors, we have an amazing administrative assistant counseling, Judith Mendez, who can help support as well to make sure that we're there to help you and support your student. So please, it's definitely something we want to support our students with and our families, and our website has a variety of resources as well. So that's something in a non-crisis situation certainly could be reviewed and looked at. But if there's a need, we really want to be there for you, for your family, for your students. So please do reach out. We're there for that.
Yeah, and I pulled up our counseling page just so you have an idea. There's a social emotional link on here. Also, there is on our homepage a parent resources tab as well. And this parent resources does have suicide information and procedures. And then there's also a safety tab as well that will also get you some additional information. It will link you to additional suicide prevention and procedures. And just to take a look at our district website as well, under parents and students, there is a tab specifically for student supports. There's a lot of great information in here. This is kind of our philosophy that we are educating the entire student and we have supports available. So there's specific supports available depending on your student's needs. There's also community resources that you can be linked to. So there is a lot of information here, and please, it can be overwhelming if you are dealing with the emotions and the fear working with your own student. So please don't feel like I need to go through all of these resources before reaching out to us. We would be happy to work in partnership with you and help you navigate resources outside of school, as well as partner with you so that we can support your student here. So on that note, I kind of just want to make sure we can take some time with Stan and have him answer any of your questions that you may have.
All right, great. Thanks, Jamie. So with that, one of the questions I saw come in was about how's Jesse's family doing? Breaks my heart to report this. A couple years ago, Jesse's older brother actually died by suicide. So that was a really traumatic experience for me and my brother and his family, of course. And I think part of the reason why is that they just never talked about it. We never opened up about it. I think that one of the lessons I would like to impart from that tragedy or that subsequent tragedy is that it's so vital that we talk about this. If there is a death within a family, if you're supporting a youth who has lost somebody to suicide, to just open it up. Because what I have found is that when we sweep it under the rug and hide it in the closet, it becomes a combustible situation. And what suicide and suicide prevention needs is sunlight. It needs daylight. We need to bring it out and talk openly about it. And earlier I was asked, well, what are some of the things we can do to support a youth who's lost somebody to suicide? For one, this is going to sound weird, so I don't know if this is going to make sense, but one of the hardest parts about losing somebody to suicide is the why, to try to wrap your head around the why. I know for me and Jesse, I still every once in a while think, just why? And I don't know if this is going to make sense, my weird analogy, but I mentioned I had COVID earlier in the fall. And I spent the first week COVID sick as a dog. And I kept trying to wrap my head around, well, where did I get this? Why am I sick? Why am I sick? And so instead of focusing on healing, I was trying to solve an unsolvable problem. I never was going to find out where I got it. And with suicide, we do the same thing. We want to understand the why so we can put it in a box and wrap a bow around it and we know where to fit it on the shelf. But the why is something, unfortunately, that we don't know. Another thing I would encourage you to share about with youth who have lost somebody is when you lose somebody to suicide, unfortunately, most of the narrative of their life now becomes consumed by the manner in which they died. But that person had an entire life. Jesse, it wasn't nearly long enough, but he had a whole 15 years of his life that had nothing to do with suicide. And so giving them opportunities to remember who they were in life, to ask them about, hey, what was the time they made you just crack up and belly laugh? What was their favorite song? What was their favorite snack? What did they like to do? What was your favorite thing to do with them? And, early on, start to build some memories so that it's not just all wrapped in tragedy. But just giving them opportunities to talk about it. Another thing with youth is that a lot of times the death won't even really sink in for sometimes weeks or months. And so youth are on a totally different grieving timeline than we as adults are. Unfortunately, the older you get, the more you lose, the more you kind of get into these habits. But how a youth loses a friend, especially to suicide, is going to shape a lot of how they're going to respond to loss and grief moving forward. So we have to create the space. Another kind of response to it, I would say, is that finding a specialist, a mental health professional who focuses on complicated grief or what they call suicide bereavement can be really helpful as well. So with that, I saw some other questions that haven't come in. And again, if you have more questions, there's still a lot of you out there. Type them in the chat, type it in the Q&A. So one of the questions that just came in was like the manner in which they died, or the method that they used. And that is a question that also came in about data, like in what ways are youth attempting or dying by suicide? I can talk a little bit about the data. I will kindly or respectfully decline to ask that question and use this as a teachable moment. That is a loss survivor. That's a really tough question to hear because just by hearing the question, I immediately picture in my head because I know how he did. So just something. It's just a question you want to try to avoid asking a loss survivor. And I'm not calling anybody out who asked the question. It's a perfectly reasonable question that a lot of people ask. But it's just something as a loss survivor kind of competency, just respect thing we try to avoid. But what we know is that the majority of youth attempt suicide using overdose. The majority of actual suicide deaths are either by firearm or by suffocation or hanging. So that's why it's so important to have conversations about lethal means safety, talking to your doctor, talking to a mental health professional about how can you make How can you make your environment safe? Another question coming in is, will this information presentation be shared? I believe we're recording it. I'm also happy to share the PowerPoint. Anything we can do to get this information out, we're happy, and please share it, talk about it. And again, if you ever are interested in me coming in and providing a training, I'm more than happy to do that. Another question that we got from the survey was, a lot of people were asking about, like, they talked to parents who said they never saw it coming. And I think that's a common response to just about anybody who loses somebody to suicide, that we never saw it coming. I know I sure felt that way. But what I know is when I got educated, I was like, oh, okay, that was there. Okay, that was there. And again, as parents, I think parents have the hardest time connecting the dots, as I talked about earlier, about seeing a warning sign and recognizing it as a warning sign. Another thing to understand too is that when I talk to youth, parents are the person that they are trying the hardest not to see the warning signs a lot of the time, because they don't want to disappoint you. They don't want to let you down. You've done so much and invested so much in them. They don't want you to know. And one of the hardest things for you too is when there's not like a trauma that they've been through, they struggle even more, because it's, why do I feel this way? I don't have any right to feel this way. I know there's kids in my school who are going through abuse and neglect. I have wonderful parents. I got a good life. I'm fed every day. Like, what do I have to be sad about? But that's where mental health and mental illness come into play. Mental illness doesn't care where you're from, how nice your house is, or how wonderful the people in your life is. And so that's another important conversation. But I think that's why it's so important to set the table, create space for conversations about mental health, so that youth feel safe. They don't have to hide those warning signs. They're just honest with you when they're struggling, when they're having a hard time. Another question that was asked in the survey was, how does social media or technology, how is that impacting our youth? And I hear a lot of people say that social media causes suicide. And again, going back to that idea of cause, I don't think anything causes suicide, but I don't think social media causes it. I heard somebody describe this really eloquently one time. They said that social media decreases protective factors, decreases that connectedness, but it increases risk factors. Similar to isolation or technology, it's reducing those positive coping skills while increasing that risk of isolation, and some other pieces. Some good questions coming in. Oh, sorry. Will this information be shared with students? Yes, we have plans already in place to touch base with your student. I'm going to modify it. Some of you might be sitting there with your students right now, but we're gonna modify it for the youth and make it more friendly and hopefully meet them where their needs are at. Another question is, do you advocate that high schools offer a positive psychology class? So that's part of that conversation. It's not just positive psychology, it's social emotional learning. Jamie mentioned that earlier. A lot of people don't necessarily connect that social emotional learning is suicide prevention. It's shown to increase protective factors, decrease risk factors. There's a lot that we can do for suicide, to prevent suicide, that never says the S word. This is where we get to them upstream. There's a program called the Good Behavior Game, and it's done in 2nd and 3rd grade. And they did a 20-year longitudinal study of youth who participated that. And I mean, what years? 9 years old when you're in those grades, followed them for 20 years. 20 years later, youth who, or young adults who had participated in that program, had lower incidence of suicide attempts, substance abuse, self-harm, and all these other negative activities. So not just at a young age, but all the way through high school, we really need to change how we're doing that. Schools have been working that way with social emotional learning, but we do have plans to not only talk about suicide prevention, but mental health, and normalize these conversations on a more regular basis with your youth. Because that's, in the learning sessions I've had with youth over the past couple of weeks and over the past year, they just want to be heard. They just want space. You know, one of the simple things they ask for from their teachers and from their parents is just for you to tell them that you care about them. It's just for you to tell them that you love them, that you're proud of them, they're doing great. As simple as that. That's all they're asking for, is I just want to know that somebody cares about me. I'm going to look over, see if there's any other questions.
There's a couple in the Q&A.
Okay, cool. I'm just seeing those now. Thanks. So one of them is, do people who have suicide thoughts repeat or not really? And this is actually, I forgot to mention this. I apologize. This is actually one of the spots of good news. 70% of people who make a suicide attempt will not ever attempt suicide again in their lives. 90% of people who make a suicide attempt will not go on to die by suicide in their life. So what we know, and this comes back to that idea of means safety. We talked a little bit about means and methods, But if someone survives a suicide attempt, they are very unlikely to repeat that. And that's why restricting access to the most lethal forms, such as firearms, is so important. Not that we want anybody to attempt, but if they survive that attempt. And I think this is important because oftentimes when someone has had thoughts of suicide or had a mental illness or made a suicide attempt, we treat them like this fragile piece of glass that will forever need to be held with baby gloves. And the reality is, and I know this isn't, I said I'm an EMT earlier. I know this isn't a perfectly appropriate, accurate medical analogy, but we always say that when a bone grows back, it grows back stronger. And there's something that we refer to as post-traumatic growth. So if someone can get through a suicide attempt and get the help and support that they need, they are more than likely not to go back to that space. Now, part of the problem, though, is that a lot of youth will make an attempt and adults will never find out about it. Or they'll make an attempt and their parents or guardians will never connect them to the appropriate help. So again, it's all in how we respond. How can we help if we know they are struggling but don't want the help? That's really one of the toughest parts. And one of the things I would say is just to be gently persistent. And, just think about it. What are some of the reasons that somebody wouldn't ask for help? Maybe they don't want to burden you. Maybe they already feel like they're a burden. Maybe they feel like they have tried everything. So what are you possibly going to offer them that they already haven't done? And so I think we have to look at it first with a different mindset and say, what would be some of the reasons why this person doesn't want to accept help? Not just how can we convince them to get help? Other than that, though, what I would really encourage you to do is, one, connecting with the crisis resource, the Lifeline. They may be able to help guide you. I would also really encourage you to reach out to your school. And this is overall with your students' mental health, your child's mental health. A lot of parents don't reach out to the wealth of resources available at the school out of fear that it's going to haunt their kid and it's going to prevent them from doing something in life. A lot of people don't realize that any health records or mental health records that your child has will never touch their academic records. So if they go to apply for college, they go to apply to the military, they are kept totally separate. They are not part of their cumulative academic file. And so please, please don't ever hesitate to reach out to your school. If for no other reason, to have more eyes being vigilant to look out for your school. It takes a village. So reach out for help. And Rhonda or Jamie, you're welcome to hop in on that one if you like. I'm just going to look and see. Another question comes in. Are there any gender specific signs to look for or difference between boys and girls? Not necessarily. I talked a little bit about anger and aggression. In the day and age, it's hard to be binary, but if you were to try to group it into two, I would say that the anger, the aggression, in my opinion, is something we see more commonly with the males, which I think is why we miss a lot of male suicides. We know that 70% of suicides in America are by males, but we also know that females attempt suicide 4 times as often as males. So to clarify that, there is a larger number of females who attempt suicide among all ages every year. But of the males who attempt, even though the number is smaller, the percentage who die from that attempt is higher. So there's a greater number of males who attempt. So it's not so much a change or a difference gender-wise in terms of warning signs, but the impact, the way in which they attempt, and the attempt data versus the death data is where we see the differences. But every one of us is different. So it's hard to assign this warning sign to that gender and that warning sign to that gender. Just looking at the questions, I apologize for turning away for a second. There's a couple of you are actually educators yourselves out there. So you're welcome to contact me to talk about it, but there's no perfect formula for engaging youth on these topics. But again, a smaller conversation. I think back to that gymnasium where I gave the presentation in high school, and I am just mortified and just terrified to think that with 3,000 kids, statistically speaking, there were absolutely kids in that audience who were currently having thoughts of suicide. Like the girl, Sarah. Fortunately, it was a positive message, but I think, man, if I was having thoughts of suicide and I was forced to be crammed into a gymnasium how awful that would be, like to try to put on this mask and keep it together. And so that's why those smaller group settings for conversations about mental health and suicide prevention are important. You can get a read on the students. There's time for question, dialogue, a little bit more confidentiality. But it's never just one presentation that's going to make the difference. We have to continually, regularly build in the life skill of talking about mental health and suicide prevention. But for the individual who asked the question about how to do that, please reach out, and I'm happy to work with you or your school to bring that that education. So one of the questions out there is, how do we deal with perfectionism? I don't know that I have the answer. I wish I did, but I think, because a lot of times it's not you putting pressure on the kid, right? It's them putting pressure on themselves. And one thing I remember learning or coming to terms with when I was in college is that, I'm turning 40 this year, and I would say that my generation is kind of one of the first generations where it's always been the plan, right? The grandparent makes it better for their child, and they make it better for their child. And every generation kind of increases, and whether that's economically or socioeconomically. But that's just not the case. I mean, at some point that's going to plateau. At some point that's going to drop off a little bit. But youth have these unrealistic expectations. One of the things I talk to youth, the ones who are really stressed out about their performance or their academic grades, I almost make a joke with them. I tell them, I'm like, I remember when I was in high school and I did badly on a test. And I'm like, well, I did badly on this test. And I did badly on this test. So I'm going to get a bad grade in the class. Get a bad grade in the class. My GPA is going to drop 0.02 points. Now I'm not going to go to the college I want. I don't get the college I want. I'm not going to get the job I want. I don't get the job I want. I'm not going to marry the person I want. I don't marry the person I want. I'm going to be. And so it's like this just overwhelming snowball effect from this one grade. And the reality, as strange as it sounds, my most successful friends are the ones who went to junior college for anywhere from 2 to 6 years and then went into the workforce. So I don't think it's necessarily something that a parent can reduce. I don't think it's necessarily just a school. I think it's working in partnership, and we have to just change the culture in our kids that your life is not predicated on how well you do on this test right now. Let's see. All right, looking through some of the questions. Getting some support saying that I need to talk to the kiddos directly, and for now that's the plan. I hope they will relate to me. I got a few years of youth left in me that I can, but I really enjoy it. I spent a lot of time working with youth, the Directing Change program that I do. I'm blessed to have the opportunity to work work directly with you. So I take that as a huge compliment and a vote of confidence for those of you out there encouraging that I get connected directly with the youth, and that's our plan. But they need to hear from everybody, not just me. I'll set the table, I'll start it, but they need to hear it from you. They need to hear from the educators. They need to hear it at the Boys and Girls Club, the YMCA, the adults, everybody in their life. We all need to talk about it more. This is a really interesting question. Is there a documentary that you like on the topic of suicide or depression? Sadly, I would say the list is much longer on the documentaries and the films that I dislike. I would say one of the films I think is really well done is called The S Word. It's by Lisa Klein. It came out about 1.5 years ago, and it, maybe not age appropriate. So watch it first before you watch it with your kid. There's a little bit of swearing in it, and some of the context is a little bit mature, but it basically tells the story of 4 people who have lived through a suicide attempt and helps paint the picture of them as entire individuals. It talks a little bit about a family. That's a good one. There's another one out there that's good called Tell My Story. This is a newer one about a father's experience of losing his child. But as far as for youth education, unfortunately, there's not really a lot of great content. But I can put a list together. There's another one, and I'm just not thinking of it right now, that is more of a youth documentary. But unfortunately, most of the time, whether it's film, TV shows, or documentaries, they're typically not in line with safe messaging. So I hesitate to recommend them because I worry about the harm that they might do. So, all right, well, I don't see any more questions or chat. Robert or Jamie, tell me if I'm missing anything.
You're good.
I also feel like I've been talking forever, so I'm sure many of you are probably getting sick of hearing my voice, but Let's see. This is respectfully. So I'll go ahead and answer this one really quickly. I'm not speaking to district protocol. I'm not talking to LCC. I'm talking about where we're moving. So the question asks, if a child has been through an incident, whether they've had a crisis moment, a suicide attempt, how is that communicated back to the staff? And unfortunately, the process and practice has been up until recently that if the parent says we're not allowed to talk about it, then we're not allowed to talk about it. And that's why, again, it's so valuable for you as parents to communicate back to the school when you have struggles, because to some degree, why wouldn't you want another, sixth set of eyes looking out for your kid on a day-to-day basis? And you don't have to give them the details. But I think a lot of that was based in the fear of that idea of health records and academic records all being met together. There's some tools out there and some strategies that schools can use where they're not giving details, but they're giving a heads up to the teacher, just kind of a handle with care message. Hey, this child's been through something. But one of the best things that you can do if your child is struggling is communicate that to your school and give them the permission and the guidance to talk to some of the other teachers and staff on campus. Again, it's a village to keep kids safe. So that would be my encouragement. I'll turn it over to LCC staff to talk about any of the specifics though.
Yeah, thank you, Stan, and great questions, and I appreciate all the family members and staff members here. We live by something called see something, say something, hear something, send something, not only for our kids, but for our staff. So anytime we have any inclination or information that we can use to support and save lives and support one another, that is something we emphasize across the board to our entire staff. So again, like Stan said, it does take a village to come together and really support 1,800 students on this campus, and 150 staff members on this campus as well. So I just want to thank you, Stan, for one of the things that I appreciate about your presentations. It's real. It's from the heart, and I just appreciate the questions that are out here. So if there are any other questions for Stan, we can address them now, but otherwise, Jamie, Bobby, Rhonda, do you guys have anything you want to add?
Again, Stan, thank you for being here. I do think one last kind of question that's in there that I think you could definitely provide some insight. Kids that are good at hiding those thoughts, and I know in the survey there was also questions about whether or not you always see signs. Are the signs there before a suicide attempt happens? Stan, you're muted.
It was really eloquent and beautiful, I promise. It's not going to be as good this time around. But earlier we talked a little bit about, why students want to hide these warning signs. Again, for a variety of reasons. They don't want to be a burden. They don't think that anybody can make it better. So there's not really a why that we can understand. But as far as missing them, I think the reality is that, we have set up suicide prevention like a cat and mouse game for the most part, is that we train people and then we have to see it and we have to engage and we have to recognize, and that's good. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. But what we really need to build towards with our youth is giving them the skills and the resiliency and the strength to let people know when they're not doing okay. So we don't have to play this guessing game, that we make it normal for youth to say, hey, I'm not all right. I'm not okay. And that's not something that not just the school can do. That's something that not just the parents can do. It's something that we as a community and a society have to change. So I don't know that we have the answers for it. But I guess my one response would be, that's why we have to always create space for our youth about mental health and let them know that it's okay to not be okay, and talk to them about the struggles you had as a youth and justify every emotion that they have and are dealing with. So I'm sorry I can't answer that better, but we just do as much as we can, as hard as we can, for as long as we can. And we have to bring our communities together, where this shouldn't be one of the few times in a year where we as a community, as school and parents get together and talk about the mental health of our youth. It needs to be something we're constantly vigilant about. Well, we're probably going to turn it over for a closeout. So if I can just say one thing before we do that. I know this presentation has been probably very emotional and overwhelming for you. I can't think of anything scarier than losing a child to suicide. And that's going to, you know, your natural reaction is going to be to want to turn away from this. And I have so much respect and appreciation for those of you who showed up tonight and jumped in. I wish there was, you know, literally thousands of more parents who came. But I just want to say I appreciate you. Again, it's very hard to do the wrong thing. Just create the space, tell them you love them. I don't know, but we're going to figure this out together and just jump in the mud. That's all the kids tell me that they want. So you are more qualified for this than you think you are. Trust your instincts. And yeah, just thank you again for joining us tonight. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Rena.
We actually have Dr. Coy close out for us this evening. So Dr. Coy.
I just want to thank Stan for the wonderful presentations today, for sharing his heart, his story, and for being a light for our campus and for our community. So Stan, thank you again. It's a difficult conversation. It's a hard conversation, but it's a conversation that we need to be having. And I just appreciate you being here. As it was shared in the chat, we will be connecting with our students with a similar presentation and providing our teachers with the resources to support them if something were to come up or something were to come out of those conversations. We know these are difficult times, and we just want to thank you all for taking time out of your evening to be here, to be a part of our community, and to remember that we are part of a Maverick family. We take that very seriously, and thank you. Thank you for your time.
Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Take care. Stay safe.